It's a complete delight to have you here, Iain. I'm going to carry on, in a way, hopefully seamlessly from where Iain left off and where my Tribandhu left off. Particularly, I want to explore with you the final chapter, chapter 28, I believe, the sense of the sacred, which over dinner I was saying that to me it feels like the culmination of the whole magnificent 2-volume, 3-part epic that is The Matter with Things. The sense of the sacred is where you conclude. And perhaps we could start with, you talk about the limits of reason. You talk about how, well, you've mentioned unknowing. You talked about not knowing is not the same as ignorance. If I could just read a couple of sentences. There is an unknowing, the other side of ignorance, which is far superior to both knowing and ignorance. There is an innocence, the other side of experience, which is superior to both experience and naivety. And a wisdom, the other side of folly, which is superior to both folly and common sense. So I wondered if you could say something more about the limits of reason and the importance of unknowing when approaching the sacred.
Yes, I suppose I should begin by saying that I am no foe of reason, as I am no foe of science. I immerse myself in both and am hugely reliant on what they can give us, but it would be itself irrational and incidentally unscientific to suppose that science and reason had answers to everything. It doesn't really make any sense. And there's plenty that is not irrational, as we say, but is simply not contained by reason. For example, response to a piece of music. It's not encompassed by reason, but it's, if you like, supra-rational or trans-rational. It's beyond reason. It's just not limited by reason. But it would be a fool who thought that because it couldn't be reasoned into existence for us, it didn't exist. And of course the same is true of many kinds of human experience.
Well, you argue is not the right word, but you posit that there is a divine, a sacred, however we want to term it, because there has to be something beyond what we can apprehend through reason. You asked why is there something rather than nothing at all in the cosmos.
Yes, yes. I suppose I would just resist slightly the formula because, in that this is again not a matter of simple reason. Although there's nothing irrational about supposing there's a divine, and it accords with experience, in my view. It would be very extraordinary, wouldn't it, if our minds and our brains were so constructed that they could understand everything. I mean, why? Especially if you believe that we evolved, then presumably we're partway along a path. I mean, no doubt a mouse, if it could formulate it, might say, I know everything, you know, but we know it doesn't. Mind you, mice know things we don't. So it's always a matter of, you know, the context. So I don't, as you, I think were saying yourself, you know, I don't exactly argue this, but I do begin from a very important question which modern Anglo-American analytic philosophers have got round by declaring it a not permissible question. So all the really important issues, all the really difficult questions, which are the ones that philosophers should be dealing with, philosophers say they're not real questions. So that makes life simple, you know. But really these things carry on, for any of us who are thinking and reflecting while we're living, being very important questions. And they don't lead just to dead ends because we have no final answer. The process of addressing them alone is rather, as I was saying before, that it's something that contains its purpose or its meaning or whatever in the process. That we need to examine this. And a number of people said to me, who had read my text, I think you shouldn't go into this sacred thing, you know, because there's a lot of really good science, really good philosophy here, But, and, well, I wasn't open to that idea at all, because in a way I felt that it was the keystone of the whole thing, really. Yeah. And one reviewer said to me, and I thought it was rather a nice thing to say, that having read the book, that he felt that there was something coming in ever more about to be, as Wordsworth says, coming into being in the process of reading. And it was fractal. So there were bits of all of it in the parts of it, which I really like, because I think that if you followed me through the thing, though I don't talk about the divine at all, I'm opening up, I hope, people's minds to a place where they can entertain this. And until one's entertained it, one has no way of knowing whether it's worth rejecting or not. I mean, and to entertain it means not just saying, well, it might be, and then moving on. One needs to be able positively to open oneself to the possibility that this exists. And I, in the Master in His Emissary, I say, you know, that people who believe don't have a certainty. It's not a propositional certainty. It's a disposition of the spirit or soul, in which we place ourselves in a certain relation to the world, and it's out of that something comes forth, and that they act as if God were. And that's the most we can know. And if we act as if God were, we may well find that probably this is a reality that has changed my life and given back to life. And that's all we can know. We can't have the facts written down and look them up in a book, you know, which is why I always say that religious fundamentalists and religious fundamentalist atheists are, you know, cut from the same cloth.
Yes, both left hemispheric.
Very left hemispheric. I'm right, you're wrong. It's in a book here, we know what it is, these are the rules, you abide by these and you're home and dry. But actually, nothing in life is at all like that, and in this area, particularly not.
You talked about a sense of wonder, don't you, as part of this disposition?
I think that's a terribly important part. And, you know, I might just mention that both Plato and Aristotle said that philosophy begins in wonder. And Goethe said the same and said, and ends in wonder. And I think Goethe, as always, was right on the money. I mean, most brilliant philosopher, scientist, thinker of the last 500 years in Europe.
Well, Einstein said something similar, didn't he, about there are two ways to live your life. One is as if nothing is a miracle, and the other is as if everything is a miracle. Certainly it's attributed to him.
Yes, indeed.
I wonder if you can say something more about this responsiveness as in relation to this disposition towards the divine. So you've touched on wonder, but there's a receptivity, an active receptivity as well, isn't there, when you talk about
Well, that receptivity is bound up with negation. And this is where I want to mention two things. I want to mention the Kabbalah, the Jewish body of mystical literature. And I want to mention Meister Eckhart, the most important mystic of the medieval West, I think. And first, the Kabbalah, which I only came across in the last 5 years. And it was completely a revelation to me. There's something called the Lurianic Kabbalah, which means the Kabbalah according to the version of Isaac Luria, who lived in the 17th century, 16th century. And there is a creation myth, which I'm sorry, some of you who follow my things would have heard me say this before, but I think it's so important, I'm going to say it again. It talks about creation in 3 phases. And the first state of affairs is that there is just a single being about whom we can say nothing. And its name, Ein Sof, either means what is or it means nothing, actually. And Ein Sof's nature was relational, had love in it. And for there to be relation and to be love, there must be something other. And if it's not truly other, but really secretly part of it, then it doesn't manifest. So what was Ein Sof's first act of creation? Was it to reach out a hand and make mountains? No, it was to withdraw, to make a space in which there could be something other. And then in that space, there were certain vessels that were to receive what was to be created in this space. And one single spark came out of Ein Sof and fell on these vessels and shattered them. And then there is a third phase, which is repair. And this is a phase in which, according to this tradition, human beings play a very important part, which is the repair of these broken vessels in such a way that they are more beautiful and more spiritually rich than they were before. And that reminds me of a tradition in Japanese ceramics called kintsugi, I think, in which a broken bowl or something of the kind can be repaired using gold in such a way that it's actually more beautiful than it was before. And I sometimes think also it's something one can say about human beings that have lived, you know, that they're like an old wine or a wonderful old piece of furniture, that there's damage to them, there's sort of, you know, things have changed and there's marks on them, but it's that makes them beautiful. Anyway, where was I? Yeah, so that's that's one thing. And of course, for those of you who know my stuff, I believe that the way in which things come into being for us is that they first are taken in by the receptivity of the right hemisphere, which we know, it's not just an opinion of mine, we know from experimentation, this has been much written about by Elkin and Goldberg, that the first experience of anything comes to the right hemisphere, and almost immediately, I mean, the split second is taken up by the left hemisphere, where it has boxes, like the urns, the vessels, and it says it's one of those. But actually it's much bigger than any of those, and so the categories don't really suffice. And so something has to be put together again, which is better than it was before. And it wouldn't have been better if there'd never been the breaking up part that the left hemisphere does. So it goes from right hemisphere, the initial receptivity, the left hemisphere with the analysis into parts, the right hemisphere with the bringing it together again as a new whole. And I sometimes say that's like learning a piece of music. You're first attracted to the whole thing, you then practice it and you have to break it up into bits and you see it from the point of view of music theory, but then when you actually go to play it for somebody, you forget all that. You must forget it, otherwise you wouldn't play well. But it's not that it would have been better had you not done that work. You had to do that work. And it's slightly like, sorry, too many analogies here, but it's slightly like the thing about, you know, before Enlightenment, chopping wood and carrying water, after Enlightenment, chopping wood and carrying wood. But slightly different chopping wood and carrying wood. So the other thing was, yes, from Meister Eckhart, and I've see, really what I wanted to say is that in the Buddhist tradition and in, I think, most spiritual traditions, there is this idea of emptying, undoing, unknowing, unsaying, and as a fertile darkness, emptiness and silence, which is not just a blank, but is something richly poised to bring things into being, a field of potential. And I say we switch out the light in order to see the stars. In one sermon, Eckhart expands on the meaning of darkness. This is Meister Eckhart, 14th century mystic. You cannot do better than to place yourself in darkness and unknowing, he says. And he imagines a bystander asking him, but what is this darkness and unknowing, and what is its name? To this he replies, I can only call it a loving and open receptiveness, which, however, in no way lacks being. It is a receptive potential by means of which all is accomplished. Extraordinary, isn't it?
Wonderful, wonderful. And you yourself have coined the unword, the term the unword.
The unword, yes.
And well, I mean, you talk about God, and you talk, but the way you talk about God as a Buddhist, I have no issue with. Buddhism, as you know, doesn't use the language of God. Doesn't
Absolutely.
Find that language predominantly helpful, and tries to find other ways of talking about the divine, the transcendent. But this concept of unwords is very, very resonant. It's a wonderful concept.
Well, yes, I'm referring there to the fact that in all the philosophical and traditions of different cultures, there is a word for this thing that underlies everything and gives it being and brings it about. And to the Greeks this was logos, to the Chinese it is li, to, in Sanskrit it's ta. It's also Allah, and in the Jewish tradition it's Yahweh. But there is also a tradition that this word is somehow special and sacred and shouldn't be said. In fact, that to say it is to bring something bad about. And I think the idea there is that the whole business of naming is a way of taking control of something, finding a place for it and saying, I see. And this can't be found a place for alongside other things. Whatever we mean by this God, it's not just something like a human being, only much more so. It is something else.
Yeah.
And so what I wanted to do was to suggest that if we don't have a word at all, it disappears from our discourse. But if we have a word, we run the risk that we will think we've now got it.
Yeah.
And so you get things like at the beginning of the Tao Te Ching, the Tao that can be named is not the real Tao.
Yeah.
And St. Augustine says, si comprehendis non est Deus. If you understand it, it's not God that you understand.
Yeah.
And lovely fact, there's a parallel there with Richard Feynman, who said, if you understand quantum mechanics, you don't understand quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
And I think that's not an accidental parallel, actually.
Yeah.
So it's about unthinking the ways we normally think in order to have a space to understand this.
Yeah.
And so I say, look, with many reservations, we need to bring this concept into the picture, because it's what lies behind it that matters. It's all that's implicit in it.
Yeah.
It's not the thing we focus on with the left hemisphere that likes the language. You notice that the bystander in Eckhart said, and what is its name, by the way? Because then I've got it in my directory.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
We can't exactly avoid discussing it, but on the other hand, we mustn't discuss it in such a way that we think we've ever pinned it down. And this leads to what's known in certainly in the Western tradition, Christianity, as the apophatic mode, which is the no-saying way in which you don't affirm what God is, but you say all the things that people might mistake for God and clear away. So it's rather like this idea, as I say, of discovering.
Yeah.
And in Greek, the word for truth is aletheia, which means unforgetting. In other words, we live in a cloud of forgetting, and it's unforgetting that allows us to understand. So that's the thing that we must, and you know, I end the book really saying, I can't specify this thing. I know it may seem to some people very difficult, but my sense is that it's the most important element we can have in our picture of the cosmos.
Yes. And if we, as you say, if we don't talk about it, we forget it.
Yes.
And we assume that there's nothing there.
Yes.
Buddhism tries to tread this very fine line, the middle way between eternalism and nihilism.
Absolutely.
And constantly has to correct itself, because anything that you say will veer one way or the other. And I think you do a marvellous job in this book and in this final chapter of steering
thank you.
something of that middle way.
It was very, very difficult.
Yes,
I mean, it cost me more pains than anything I've ever written, because everything I wrote seemed wrong, which is true.
Yeah.
And in a way I felt a bit of a fool, because what you're telling everyone is that it's foolish to try and say these things. But I thought, I know, therefore, that I'm going to fail, but it's better that I fail as best I can than I give up the task.
Well, it's a courageous and a worthwhile endeavour. And I think
whatever. Thank you.
Yeah. I wonder if
I'm saying nothing.
Well, at the risk of moving into a sort of a model that again could be misinterpreted, I was struck by your discussion of panentheism.
Right, yes.
Because I hadn't come across panentheism before. That it unites or seems to unify the notion of both immanence and transcendence as the divine in all things, but also more than the sum of all things.
Yes, that's right.
I wonder if you can say something more about panentheism, because I'm not sure everybody will be familiar with it, and also distinguishing it from pantheism.
Yes. Well, pantheism comes from two Greek roots, pan meaning all and theos meaning God. And it basically is the belief that God is all things, the sum of all things, and that all things are God. Panentheism puts N in the middle, which means in. And this is an importantly different belief, that God is in all things, but is not exhausted by an inventory of all those things, and that all things are in God, although they don't all themselves add up to God. So this brings again a field of further, the something more, the something further, whereas pantheism seems to me to close things down and go, we know, we've got it now. And it's a very beautiful idea, because as you say, it combines this idea that God is immanent, is in all things, but also that God is something transcendent, that is more than and beyond. And you said earlier something about holding these two difficult positions together in Buddhism. And as you know, I have a chapter called The Coincidence of Opposites, which explores this whole idea, which Niels Bohr, one of the great figures in the founding of quantum mechanics, said that really deep truths also have an opposite, which is deeply true. And that trivial things don't have this structure. So, for example, either I had milk in my coffee this morning or I didn't. It's not sensible to say, well, I had both. On the other hand, the really important things embrace their opposites. And the trick is not to allow this to collapse into it's this or it's that. And this I call a dipole, and the image of it that I often use is that of a magnet. The North Pole and the South Pole are simply not the same thing at all. And yet both of them combine to make the magnet, and there isn't a clear demarcation between them either. And if you cut one of them off because you didn't like it, it would reinstate itself, because that's the nature of a magnet. So that's what I'm thinking of by the concept of a dipole. And incidentally, I think it's very important that there is a role for saying it's either this or it's that. I don't think we should ignore that. But it's very important that we should also maintain that it's both this and that in cases where this is true. And so I sometimes say we don't want to have either or both and. We need to have both either or and both and in our vision. And I think that that's not just playing with words. And one of the lovely things about it is that it makes sense of a number of things. It makes sense of what Wordsworth, I think, is describing, where he talks about a spirit that rolls through all things, you know, and this idea of, again, something ever more about to be, this coming into being, which is actually, curiously enough, there in the, I'm sorry, I can't resist these asides, but it's there in the story of Moses and the burning bush, because God is recorded as saying, at least in the English translations, I am that I am. But I gather that the Hebrew words actually mean I will be what I will be, which suggests that God is also coming into being all the time, becoming more and more God through the coming into being of God's creation. And it's only through the existence of the dipole of these two things that each of them comes to be what they are. And the other nice thing about it is that it makes sense of a concept which otherwise seems like believing three impossible things before breakfast, which is the Trinity. And this idea is not actually peculiar to Christianity. And a simple Franciscan monk once said to me something which may or not be accepted by clever theologians, but it helped to explain things to me, was that the idea of the Trinity is like a book. Is the book what was in your mind or the mind of the writer when they were writing it? Or is it this book here on the table? Or is it what happens when somebody takes the book up and reads it? Each of them is the book, but they have different qualities. And this means this business of panentheism brings together these concepts of the thing and the mentality behind it. And in fact, you find it in Sufism as well. So I think Rumi says that the water is both the spring, it is the cup that bears the water to the mouth, and what flows forth.
For me, the analogy in Buddhism is that enlightenment is to be found nowhere else but here and now, in this form, in this individual form, and yet it is a transcendent reality. It's not just mere matter or mere form. And the paradox there can only be unified in this higher kind of perspective, I think.
Yeah.
Moving on, I just want to, again, in this chapter, if I can just quote you. You say throughout part 3, so there's 3 parts to this 2-volume book. Throughout part 3, I've emphasized a number of positions that are not the norm in our culture, though they are, I believe, accepted by many contemporary physicists, which was, music to my ears. And then you list 5 things. The primacy of motion over stasis, and the importance in particular of flow, something of which you've touched on. The reality of time as an expression of that extended flow, not a series of linear moments, which again you touched on with Zeno's paradox. And then the third is that consciousness and matter are not simply irreconcilable, leaving us with the problem of how to get consciousness out of matter, but in reality aspects of one another, in which consciousness is nonetheless primary. So before I come on to the other 2, I wonder if you can say a little bit more. When I interviewed you in the pandemic, you talked about matter as resistance and the importance of resistance. Anyway, you might want to touch on that.
No, I would, because of course it connects with what we've been talking about, the creativity of negation, which is always thought of in the Western tradition as somehow negative. That's the word we use. And yet, of course, famously Keats had this concept of negative capability, which was denying the thing that one hastens to do in order that something much richer should come forth. To remain in doubts and whatever it is without
uncertainties.
A very important point for me is that resistance is part of this picture. It's not just a sort of uniform flow of whatever that has no other in it, because what creates everything in the flow in a river is the turbulence that comes from other shapes and forms which may be generated by rocks or stones or by other parts of the flow and so forth. And it's this that brings forth things, so that everything creative comes from a flow that also has resistance to it in it. And Coleridge actually has this image that, a piece of soap, it moves about slipperily. If you put it down on a surface, it moves about. But if you leave it for a while, the very same thing that made it slip now makes it stick. And what I think about in terms of matter and consciousness is there's a long chapter in there, which is really the length of a short book, and one day I may separately publish it as a short book, which looks at all the looks through, I hope in a rational spirit, all the possible ways in which brain and mind and matter can relate to one another. And I come to the conclusion that it's not reasonable to suppose that matter emits consciousness. It might be better said that it transmits consciousness, but even better, bringing in the idea of resistance, is that it permits consciousness. In other words, its job is to form something by offering resistance. And it's that resistance that brings the individual consciousness into being. And William James, another person who, William James, Alfred North Whitehead, spend some time reading them because they're so rich. But anyway, James says so many wonderful things, but one of them is that the image that comes forth for him is that of the vocal cords, that what enables his voice is resistance to the flow of air. It's not the flow of air, because if there were no vocal cords, he wouldn't have a voice. But it's the existence, obviously, of the flow, but the resistance to it that brings forth that individuality. And so I see creation as a matter of this this resistance, and the resistance is provided by matter. Because what is matter? It's something I know in my consciousness. I mean, I may or may not have consciousness because there's matter. We don't know that. But certainly I can only know matter because I've got consciousness. Matter is something I experience. and it's experienced in consciousness. So we can't deny consciousness, or we're denying the whole thing. But what I'd like to think of is that matter is a sort of different phase of consciousness in which it has different characteristics. And people say, but matter's not at all like consciousness. To which I say, well, ice is not at all like water, and water vapor is not at all like ice. They have completely different qualities. One is invisible, another is translucent, another is opaque, and so on and so forth. But they're all phases, according to physical chemistry, of the same entity.
Besides, if for a quantum physicist, you wouldn't be so easily able to say matter is nothing like consciousness, is not at all like consciousness. We forget, don't we, that matter itself is not understood at all and is completely mysterious.
Absolutely, and what physicists say is that, you know, biologists think they're being very hard-nosed when they come along and say it's all made up by matter.
Yeah.
And they kind of say, isn't that right? You know, to physicists, and they sort of shift about uneasily and look at their feet and mumble, yes, but actually we don't know what matter is at all.
That's right, yes.
So, because, I mean, there's a principle in science which is a good one, which you explain something you don't understand by reference to something that you already do understand.
Yes.
But the assumption that we already do understand matter is completely false.
Yes.
It's just an aspect of our consciousness.
Yes, that's right, yeah. So I've got about 4 different directions I want to go from here, because it opens up so much, doesn't it? This idea of resistance and matter being a necessary resistance. It's sort of going back to the myth that you were talking about. If the divine needs to love, it needs another.
Yes.
And therefore form is necessary.
Yes. Embodiment helps to shape something into being, and it also helps it persist for longer, because consciousness can move as fast as you like, and you can think of this and think of that. But actually, matter slows the whole process down. So since we can't do away with time and everything exists in time, matter can be thought of as the element that allows a degree of persistence.
Yes, yes. Again, that goes back to Heraclitus in a way, doesn't
yes,
it?
it does, yes, indeed. Well, everything in the end goes back to Heraclitus. as indeed Nietzsche said, you know.
Yeah. So then, this resistance and this need maybe not the right word, but this desire to love another opens up the possibility of evil.
Yes, it does. Yes,
and I wonder, you talked a little bit about evil, and I found that very, very interesting. My own teacher, Sangratshita, some of his last writings were on the nature of evil, which isn't, evil is a word that perhaps is not used in Buddhism very much. Anyway, I found it very interesting what you had to say about evil. I wonder if you could...
That's an evil question.
Well, particularly it just feels so necessary that we face the dark.
I think it's an unavoidable aspect of the freedom of creation, that things can be other than we might think was the perfect way in which they should be. And usually our judgments are formed on what we know here and now, but later we may see things in a different light. Jung talked about what he called enantiodromia, which means roads going in opposite directions. And basically he thought that things, and I think this is so true, that things that we think of as just good may contain in them the kernels of things that are evil. Yeah. And things that we think of as just evil may contain within them the kernel of something good. Yeah. And in the nowadays we have such a kind of simplistic idea of the world, that there are just things that are good, and more and more and more and more of them is better and better and better. But actually by going too far in a certain direction, because space is curved and moral space is curved, you come back round to the very thing you didn't want. So that too much emphasis on freedom can lead to tyranny and so forth. These are well known. So I think it's unavoidable. And I suppose what I would say about it is that it surely it's something about which nobody should speak glibly, and therefore nobody should feel that they can answer these questions. They are, as it were, imponderable and yet need to be pondered. And What I would say is that it's rather like my referring earlier, as it happens, to the idea that we need union and division, but we need the union of union and division.
Yeah.
And this also can be reflected on the nature of good and evil, in that good can embrace and neutralize evil, but evil can never embrace and neutralize good. Hate can never embrace love, but love can embrace hate. It has a different status, and we always think that opposites must be equal, but this is an obsession of our age. Often they're not equal, as the left and right hemisphere are not equal in their capacity to convey reality. They're both necessary, but it doesn't make them equal. And so at the moment we're in the middle of a process in which I think it's so evasive to say there's no such thing as evil. I mean, if you've had your eyes open and you know something about what's happened in just my lifetime, it's impossible to say it's just a falling away of goodness. There is a drive to something which has its own life and pursues destruction. And I think, you know, I'm not convinced at all by this idea that it's a falling away. And indeed, in Christianity, in the Lord's Prayer, which is, I suppose, the ultimate thing for which Christ is, words for which Christ is remembered, he doesn't pray that we should be a little bit better than we are at the moment. He prays that we should be delivered from evil. And he himself was tempted by the devil. This is what the Bible says. How you understand that, of course, is another matter, and so on. But I think that what it draws attention to is an idea that this is something in the core of reality, and that it possibly is part of the creative nature of the cosmos. And it's certainly not our job either to ignore it or to try and explain it or to feel we've got it, but not to ignore it.
Not to ignore it. Well, in Buddhism, greed and hatred and delusion are said to be they go very, very, very deep, as well as the potential for transcendence and enlightenment. But to ignore how deep they go is to somehow step into folly, really. It somehow...
This is not good to trivialize it.
Yes. I wonder, though, if we can... it's a sort of going back to this fractal nature of your work, which I think is a really apt way of talking about it. But the fractal nature of reality itself, the one and the many. And you talk about Indra's net, which is an image that's very familiar to Buddha's.
Is it? Yes.
It is. It's there in later Buddhism. In Mahayana Buddhism. In fact, there's a whole sort of school of Buddhism that talks about that mutual interpenetration of all phenomena, or all phenomena being reflected in each. But the one and the many, I wonder if you can say, and this Indra's net image, why it's so important and evocative.
Yes, and I have a chapter also on the one and the many, because I think it's so central to our understanding of everything. And again, Heraclitus has a saying, listening not to me but to the Logos, it is wise to accept that one is all things. And the Greek can mean all things are one, or one is all things. It's ambivalent. And that is so beautiful. Yes, the image of Indra's net is that of, I believe, and you correct me if I've got this wrong, but is a net that sort of covers the universe, and it, at each interstitial point in the net where the filaments cross, there is a jewel in which all the other jewels in the net are reflected, so that everything is within, partially in a sort of hologram-like way, contained, as you say, the part in the whole, and the whole in the part. So I like that. The other thing I like about it is it's a very good image of a way of saying that relation comes before the relata, because in a way, to begin with, before there is the net, there are just these threads, and as they cross, they make things. We go, there's a thing, there's a crossing point, that can make a net. So that our attention is drawn to the thing, which is this part of the whole. But you know, there's something else which is interesting, and I don't know that I'm going to be able to deal with this in this. Maybe it's a red herring I shouldn't follow, but that scale makes a difference.
Ah.
We think that things are the same at a large scale as they are at a small scale or an intermediate scale, but they're not. They have different qualities at different scales, so the quantity actually changes quality. And actually we all know that from our experience, that, as I say, more and more of some things just make things worse.
Yeah.
But it's also profoundly true in terms of physics, and I quote Mike Abramovich's work on this in that book, and I won't try and give it to you now, but I just wanted to pass reflection on that, that you see different things at different scales, and you know, I think it's Karpatos and Tisa who describe looking at an ant colony, and from a distance it looks like a single black thing, and as you move in it seems to be these separate things, and as you move into the various ants you see something completely different. And a point made by Freeman Dyson, who was a very great man, I mean a physicist but also a great thinker, was that as people look at large agglomerates, human beings, they see them as possibly not as mechanical as parts. So you go down, a simpler animal seems more mechanical, and then somehow the cell seems more, and you've got the DNA code, and it seems mechanical. And by the way, it isn't at all. I mean, I have a whole chapter on that. But he then says, as you go deeper and deeper, it starts being much less mechanical again, until the bits that you were hoping would give you the clue to everything just vanish,
fade away,
and you're left with, you know, the simplest thing of all, which is a quantum vacuum, which is a field, which is itself extraordinarily complex, and it cannot get more basic than it. And it's no way mechanical. It doesn't behave in a mechanical way. And you know, it's a very important point to make. I mean, really, my dear friends, if there's one thing I would want you to go away with, is a desire and a need to resist the simplistic idea that we are best understood by likening us to machines. There are so many reasons why we are not. And in one particular chapter, chapter 12, on the science of life, I make, you know, I give about 8 reasons, if you like, why we're not like machines. But the fascinating thing is that, as David Bohm predicted, and he of course is a great physicist, and you'll find I refer to his work in the book a lot. But as he said, we're in the paradoxical position that while the physicists are finding that the inanimate universe is animate, the biologists, the scientists of life, are discovering that it's inanimate, they think.
Well, there's so much there that is resonant for me as a Buddhist. But the one and the many, it's said that the enlightened mind sees, one of the wisdoms of the enlightened mind is to see the sameness of all form, that it's all empty, insubstantial. But it also, another wisdom, a complementary, as it were, wisdom of the enlightened mind, is to see the uniqueness of all form. And you need the both, this sameness and uniqueness.
Absolutely.
And none of it is, as it were, reducible to one or the other.
No, and much of the thrust of the creation of whatever one means by that, but this ongoing drive that is in the cosmos is towards uniqueness. It's the creation of uniqueness, not so as to split up the wholeness or integrity, but to give one an insight into what that integrity holds, what its potential is in that empty space that is utterly fertile, and it's the realization of all these things. And one of the things about our culture and our way of thinking is that we're constantly denying uniqueness. We're categorizing everything and seeing living people as exemplars of certain categories, where they're all quite unique. I mean, you have to generalize, I understand that. So it's always a tension between these things, but we've lost the sense of the unique, the individual.
Which is where beauty also lies.
Exactly.
Categories aren't beautiful.
Categories are not beautiful.
We're going to have to, I'm aware of time, or maybe just carrying on with this one and many. which seems very, very profound somehow, very, very important. But let me just quote what you say about Buddhism. Buddhism sometimes does say not to. That it doesn't say that all things are one.
No.
But it does say things are not two. Trying, I think, to get something to do with this sameness and uniqueness.
Yes.
But also perhaps this relational aspect, that things are not separate.
Yes, yes.
But I think there's even something more, and I love what you say here, and you appear to be disagreeing with Buddhism, but I don't think you are. Let me just read you what you say. I love this. I admire the serenity of those Buddhists who are able to say not to, and see the whole concern about good and evil as a misunderstanding caused by making false distinctions. And while I indeed believe the end point is right, that the two eventually come together, and that we cannot know what good may flow from what we call evil, or what evil may flow from what we call good, my response to not to is yes, but to. As my response to is yes, but not to. In Buddhism, central to the enlightened experience is not just wisdom, but compassion.
Yes.
And compassion is somehow predicated on this samsaric world that we inhabit, this conditioned world we inhabit, as being also an experience that's relatively real. It is too. For me and
it's also
all
not
of us
to.
who are unenlightened, it is to. And yes, it's also not to.
Yes.
If it was just not to,
Yes.
there would be no compassion. There would be no other to love.
Once again, it conflates and collapses the relationship, the encounter, as I call it.
Rather than transcend.
I think the concept of encounter is important.
Yes.
Because when we know that we encounter a person or a place or whatever it is, we know that something is called forth from us, something is enriched in us, something is happening to the other place as well. I think often holy places become holy because of the attention that has been paid to them.
Yes.
And so forth. Again, as I say, attention is a moral act because it creates the world and creates us.
Yes.
So yes, I mean, I would say we need not just non-duality, but we want the non-duality of duality and non-duality. Yes.
Yes.
And if we can bear that in mind, then things start to mean more. But I perhaps we should take up the thing about compassion while there's still time to do it, because it seems to me, as I think I said in the first part or an earlier part of our talk, we need to have this sense of awe, and we need to have this sense of humility, and we need to have this sense of compassion. But the way we think about them in the West, and these seem to be the fruits of a spiritual life, but the way we think about them in the West is dualistic in the sense that people say, oh, why do you have to have wonder or awe before something? That just makes you small. But I think exactly the opposite, that when you are in awe of something and you have a true sense of the wonder of something, you know that whatever it is that exists includes you and this, and that it tells you more about who you are.
Yes.
And that there is nothing negatively abasing about humility. Humility is a way of opening things, and is a necessary part of not knowing and so forth. It's rich and fruitful. And compassion too is not doing something just for somebody else that you sort of wish you didn't have to do or resent, but it's the opening of a spirit to somebody who is linked to you.
Yes. Well, I think it's marvellous that after, is it 1,300, 1,400 pages?
1,300 and something.
If this magnificent work, you end with unknowing, with awe, with wonder, and with the importance of humility. I think that's just, well, I find that a very, very inspiring place, and maybe a good place to finish.
May I just read the last word?
Do.
Because what you've said just rings true to what I say at the end of the epilogue. In the epilogue, I sort of look a bit at our world and so on, and how it relates to what I've been talking about. I don't want to reduce what I've said to that. But I say at the end, despite being deeply suspicious of a great deal of God talk myself, and while fully acknowledging the problematic nature of the very word God, I feel our repudiation of God is not a wise move. It's easy to misunderstand what cultures wiser than ours were trying to express by speaking of God. Still easier to reject the idea of God entirely. But easy is not enough. It is our duty to do the more difficult thing, to find out the core of wisdom in this ill-understood, though universal, insight, for that there is such an inestimably valuable core seems to me more credible than anything else I know. I've said what I can. If you wish more, I can do no better than repeat the words of the 17th century priest and physician, and by the way, poet, Angelus Silesius. Friend, that is surely enough. And should you want to read more, then go and become yourself the words, and yourself the being.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you very much.